Hey, what is going on, all you bus nuts, geeks, and enthusiasts out there? Welcome to another episode of Motorcoach World. My name is James. When I started this channel in January of this year, 2021, I promised myself that I would avoid any mention of the COVID-19 pandemic in any of my videos. The whole world was going through this pandemic, and no matter where you went, what you watched, where you turned to, you couldn't avoid being reminded about the COVID-19 pandemic. For me and everyone else who works in or with the motor coach industry, we were reminded every day, if not every minute, of the pandemic because our industry was devastated. So with all the spare time I had, I figured I would create a YouTube channel to get everyone's mind off the pandemic. It was as much for the viewers out there as it was for me in many ways. First of all, I wanted to give all the bus nuts, geeks, and enthusiasts out there a place to just nerd out. I also wanted to give all those who worked in, as well as all those who had interest in the motor coach industry, somewhere to go for 15 to 20 minutes a week, and again, forget about COVID during that time. And so I did. If you've watched this channel from episode 1 to now, you'll have noticed that I really steered clear of the COVID topic on this channel. Well, today I'm gonna break that vow because something really awesome just happened. Something that should have happened for the private motor coach industry a long time ago when the pandemic first started. Today in this video, we're gonna take a look at how the COVID pandemic affected the motor coach industry in the US, what privately owned motor coach companies tried to do to survive, and keep in mind that a lot of them didn't, and finally, how things are looking today. In March of 2020, it felt like the world stopped. Businesses, actually entire industries, all of a sudden stopped operating. People working in the food and travel industries were especially hit hard. Restaurants, hotels, airlines, and bus companies lost all their business overnight. For those who either owned a coach bus company or worked in one, well, it felt like we got hit by a bus. What looked like a bright and prosperous year to privately owned motor coach companies instantly turned into a year that looked like it would be their last, and for some private owned bus companies, it was their last. Now, there's a reason I keep calling the bus companies I'm referring to as privately owned bus companies, because there's actually a huge difference between a privately owned bus company and publicly owned bus companies. Publicly owned bus companies or operations are entities like Chicago CTA, which is an abbreviation for Chicago Transit Authority. Here in Urbana, Illinois, which is where I live, it's called the MTD, or Mass Transit District. In New York, it's called the MTA, and in Pittsburgh, there's Port Authority. Every major metropolitan city in the US has something similar to this. Anyway, these are all large publicly owned transit systems that include the city buses, the subway, or any kind of light rail system to get people around the city. Organizations such as these are employed by city employees or municipal employees that are paid by the city. When the pandemic hit, services like these did lose a lot of their ridership too, and a lot of their bus operators as well as staff lost their jobs or got furloughed. But as for the organizations themselves, they're once again publicly funded, which means they don't have to make money off a passenger ticket to stay alive. In fact, most of them cost the city millions of dollars a year to operate, and they don't really make enough money to be profitable. But for publicly operated bus companies like these, the city pays for the cost of the buses, the fuel, the repairs and tools, and the drivers and staff wages with your tax dollars, or the tax dollars of those who live in the city they serve, I should say. But if you've ever been on a field trip and got to ride on a motor coach or charter bus, that bus was most likely privately owned, which means someone just like you saved up a bunch of money and purchased that bus and makes a living off of groups like your school who paid him or her for the use of the bus and the driver to take your group to where they want to go. At the end of the day, the private owner of that coach bus you rode on has to pay for the fuel out of their own pocket. They have to pay for any repairs out of their own pocket, along with driver's pay, the land that they parked the bus on, the cleaning supplies, all the way down to the seat cushion that you jammed your pencil into, or sunblind that you tore off the tracks during your bus ride because you were bored. And when their booking stopped because of a pandemic like the one we just went through, well, private bus companies are usually forgotten about and left on their own to fend for themselves. So play that through your mind real quick. Imagine that you just borrowed $500,000 from a bank to buy a motor coach. You have to pay that back slowly, just like a car loan. All of a sudden, people around you start calling you to see if they can pay you to give them a ride in your coach bus to fun destinations. And you slowly fill up your weeks and months with different people on your bus going to different places. Hey, this is pretty cool, right? You own a nice looking coach bus, you're making money with it, your passengers love to ride on your swanky new ride. Now you're making enough money to make the monthly payments on your bus to the bank, as well as pay for the fuel and repairs on it every once in a while. And whatever money is left over from that is for you to buy groceries for your family and pay for rent or mortgage so that you guys have a place to live. And maybe if there's enough money left over after you fed your family, you can finally get that sleek new iPhone you've been eyeballing. So let's say things go really well and you end up buying 2 or 3 or even 10 of these coach buses. Man, life is good. You're on a roll. People just love calling you up for rides on your shiny bus so they can ride in style. Then overnight, the phone calls stop. In fact, the next day, everyone is calling you to cancel their rides that they booked with you. Now you're giving back the money to all of your passengers to refund them. And maybe you've already spent some of that money to buy groceries for your family, pay the mortgage or rent on your home. Well, what do you do now? I mean, you're about to lose your fleet of buses and maybe your house. You're about to lose everything that you've worked for overnight. Terrifying, isn't it? According to the American Bus Association, there are 3,264 motor coach companies in the US that operate 38,720 coach buses and 2,990 motor coach companies in Canada that operates 34,885 coach buses. Well, every one of them was going through the terrifying scenario that I just painted for you. Now let me just say that bus drivers on both the public side and the privately owned side of the bus industry all suffered furloughs and job losses, and not only to drivers, I mean office staff, cleaning crew, etc. So don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying any of the drivers or support staff experience on the public or private side of the fence during the pandemic at all. I mean, I can even say the same for restaurant workers, hotel managers, and employees. This video could be 2 hours long of me mentioning all who suffered during the pandemic. I mean, it was devastating for everyone. But in this video today, I'm going to stay focused on the privately owned motor coach companies. The motor coach industry isn't exactly an industry that stands in the spotlight. Most people aren't even aware of our existence. Unlike the airlines or trains or even semi-trucks, motor coaches just don't usually have the type of glamour or fame that other transportation industries have. We're kind of obscured between the city buses and the limos. Unless you work with motor coaches a lot in your line of work, the average person will just assume motor coaches are just part of the local city bus system. And hey, some public city bus companies do own motor coaches. They kind of convert them to the commuter buses. But anyway, for the most part, that's okay. Nobody really goes into the motor coach industry to become famous or rich. But when the pandemic hit, the people in the motor coach industry realized just how forgotten they really were. In April of 2020, the US federal government saw how much money the airlines were losing due to the pandemic. They realized that without their help, a lot of the major airlines wouldn't survive and will close their doors for good. Well, that would greatly hurt the country, and the federal government wouldn't allow that to happen. I mean, what would a country be like without any major airlines after the pandemic, right? So a month after COVID started, the airlines in the US received a huge bailout. $25 billion went to the airlines to keep them afloat and to keep their pilots and employees from being furloughed. Also in April, the Amtrak passenger train system got a $1 billion bailout from the federal government after their ridership fell by 96%, because, I mean, where would the US be without a passenger train system? The publicly funded bus companies, as described before, also got a $25 billion bailout by the federal government to keep all the city buses and subways running. Now, don't get me wrong, all of which were great moves by the federal government because these are all crucial to a country's well-being. But notice I haven't mentioned the privately owned motor coach companies yet. Well, that's because we were left out.
I guess we're not invited.
Now, some would ask, come on, James, why would anyone need motor coaches during a pandemic? Why should the federal government give any money to charter bus companies? I mean, no one's going on field trips during the pandemic, right?
Your logic is flawed.
Let it be known that privately owned motor coach companies are the first ones to be called when there's an emergency that requires mass evacuations of a large scale. I mean, mom and pop motor coach companies have participated in evacuating millions of people over the years when hurricanes threatened to make landfall and saved millions of lives. Privately owned motor coach companies have also been vital in the transportation and strategic relocation of our servicemen and women across the United States. All the politicians that ran campaigns used motor coaches to tour the country. When Amtrak trains break down, private motor coach companies are the first ones they call to get their passengers the rest of the way. Even in bad weather, privately owned motor coach companies are the first ones that airlines call to transport their passengers via ground when planes can't fly. Many family-operated motor coach businesses provide line run services that transport hundreds of thousands of passengers throughout the year to airports and give the public access to other cities. And in many cases, transport more of the public on certain routes than Amtrak and even airlines do. If you do the math, without the mom and pop motor coach companies, what public organization is going to go out and provide for these kind of events? So you see, the family-run motor coach companies provide so much more to the public than being just a bus to take people on field trips and casinos and haul sports teams to games and competitions. So I hope those are enough examples, but I got a lot more if you guys want more. But like I said earlier, these families that take on the huge risk of buying these huge $500,000 pieces of equipment because of a passion to serve the public, because of the love of driving people to where they want to go, fully knowing that if things go wrong, they will face only scrutiny and criticism from the public and the media. Knowing that if their business doesn't take off, they will face certain bankruptcy and have to find other means of putting food on the table. Knowing that they have to maintain a certain level of professionalism and safety in the maintenance of their fleet equal to that of any large corporation out there, or else they face severe penalties from the Federal Department of Transportation. And for many of them, they do it gladly, with pride, integrity, and passion. Well, when it came to the transportation industry, these people were forgotten about. I mean, aside from the PPP loans and the CARES Act, there was no relief package for these family businesses similar to that of what airlines, Amtrak, and the publicly owned city transit systems. Well, the problem was, of the over 3,000 motor coach companies in the US, they were not recognized as an organization as a whole. I mean, there was no united front for the motor coach industry. When someone says airlines, almost everyone instantly thinks of all the large air carriers, Delta, American, United, etc. When someone says train, most people would think of Amtrak. When people say cruise ship, most people say Carnival or Royal Caribbean. When the term bus company is mentioned, most think of the city bus. Even if the term motor coach or coach bus was mentioned, most people would think of sports teams and band trips. So again, unless someone works with coach bus companies regularly as their line of work or rides on them regularly, few people would be able to identify it as an industry of its own, because it's just a bunch of separate small to mid-sized private businesses. So that's basically, in a very simplified way of explaining what happened when the US government was trying to decide who to bail out in the transportation sector. And without federal aid, within the first 6 months of the pandemic, many of these mom and pop family businesses closed down their motor coach companies for good. Families that were there for the public and the federal government when they needed their buses, but were forgotten about when these families needed the federal government and the public. It was clear that these privately owned bus companies needed a unified voice to represent them, to make people know of their existence if they were to survive. Well, two very important organizations stepped in to accomplish just that. Larry Killingsworth, CEO of the organization known as the United Motor Coach Association, or UMA, and Peter Pantuzzo, CEO of the organization known as the American Bus Association, or ABA, came forth to represent and give the private motor coach industry a united voice. Now, I will be making a video going into details about these organizations in the future, so I won't go into too much detail on the ABA and UMA here today. But between the American Bus Association and the United Motor Coach Association, they came together and went to the US government and represented all of the privately owned motor coach companies in the US. They made Congress aware of just how vital motor coach companies in the US are to the country, and they made them aware of what they were all going through. On May 13th, 2020, motor coach companies from all over the US united together with the help of the UMA and ABA, banded together and rallied in Washington, D.C. This group and rally was known as Motor Coaches Rolling for Awareness. Nearly 400 motor coach companies from every state of the US sent their buses, paid for by their own already dwindling funds. Over 1,000 motor coaches appeared in Washington, D.C. overnight and drove a route looping around the Capitol building. with messages painted on the side windows of the motor coaches such as "Buses Move America" and "We Are Essential." The movement delivered a message to the US government that said, "Hey, you forgot about us." Now, this was a historical occasion and the first time something like this has ever happened in the motor coach industry. It also brought all the privately owned motor coach bus companies closer together than ever before. In mid-August 2021, 15 months after the Motorcoach Rolling for Awareness movement in DC, 15 months of lobbying under one voice supported by the American Bus Association and the United Motor Coach Association, the CERTS Act, which is an abbreviation for Coronavirus Economic Relief for Transportation Services, created by the US federal government, finally provided aid to the private motor coach companies in the US. What started out as a proposed $8 billion was lowered to $2 billion to be divided up amongst the over 3,000 motor coach companies, as well as private school bus companies and other passenger carrying companies in the US. While the relief money was actually much less than what the private motor coach industry was hoping for, a significant milestone was actually achieved that day. For the first time, the motor coach industry was named specifically in a relief bill alongside airlines, public transit, and Amtrak. Today in 2021, private motor coach companies are seeing a slow return of their passengers coming back to book their buses. Most motor coach companies are still operating at a loss, with about 50% of their revenue returning in comparison to 2019, which was the last healthy year for the industry before the COVID pandemic. But with this relief from the CERTS Act, hopefully those who have survived and weathered the storm can move onward and rebuild all that they have lost. Well, folks, I hope you found today's story interesting. Please hit that like and subscribe button if you did. As always, if you're watching this, then you are part of the motor coach world.